Folks, welcome John Campbell. He wrote
Hi there.
Red Rock, The Long Strange March of Chinese Rock and Roll after he spent 10 years in China, and he's our guest tonight. So give him a round of applause. Make him feel welcome.
Thanks, Mikey.
I was going to start off by saying welcome to Red Rock. I'll be Chairman Mike. You be Johnny Be Good.
Okay.
You come straight from Ubud, so we'll treat you gently, just as they did there.
Thank you very much.
So this evening, Curious Will Centre Intellects, that's you guys. John and I will be discussing the past, present and future of Yaogun, which we'll get into and explain in a second, Chinese rock and roll. Before we get into it though, I'd like someone to count the amount of times we mentioned Yaogun. We're up to about 4 so far. I think it was all me. Sorry.
That's right.
But we'll check in at the end because that's sort of the crux of this chat. We'll explain it in a second, but first some sycophancy. John, I've been reading this book. My lovely lady who I just spotted here has been coaxing me, well, just come on, you got to finish that book. But I've been really, really, really enjoying it. And
thank you.
It's concurrently respectful and rabid at the same time. Oh. There's stories of overzealous fans drumming so hard on a desktop that one broke his hand and later insisted it was worth it. There's a story about a tree village where Yaogunners want to rock and roll all night and party every day as a lifestyle, full stop, no work. And there's quotes like, metal was Yaogun's first mistake, playing grunge was second. Lacking the sort of the subtlety, I guess. You don't so much attack the subject as sort of cradle it and treat it with a Wordsworthian romanticism. And for that, I doff my rice hat to you, sir. In your words, Yaogun is many a splendid thing. There's a many splendid thing. In my words, Yaogun is gung-ho, it's gonzo, it's maverick, it's cavalier, and it's a brave approach to making China rock and roll. You're a Yaogunner. By the end of this hour, I'll be a Yaogunner. Everyone must be sick of me saying that. Please explain to the crowd exactly what that means and how it has evolved.
Sure. So, wow, first, thank you for that introduction and those words and everything, especially the word Yaogun, which I'm glad that we're saying a lot because it's one thing that I'd like everybody, if everybody can learn one Chinese word, it's Yaogun. And if there's another word, we'll learn it later in the sort of late night section of the talk. But so Yaogun is the word for Chinese rock. It's the Chinese word for rock and roll. I mean, plain and simple. But in my mind, Yaogun isn't just a geographic thing. So that's why in the book I wanted to use that word to represent the music, because I think that when Yaogun is great, it is a thing of its own. It's the product of this long, strange march. And it's the product of a China that really came out of, I mean, a cocoon isn't the right word for it. It was a vacuum for the outside world and for the world inside of China until really the late 70s. And so we've seen, as we all read every day in the newspapers and see on the news, that China is at the tip of everyone's tongue, it seems like. And I really hope that what we can do with Yaogun is to get this window into a country that nobody understands, but everybody knows we need to know about. And so I think culture is a great way in. So for me, Yaogun tells the story of China. And the other thing I would say is that Yaogun tells the story of rock and roll in a way that we have forgotten in the West. For me, listening to people talk about their experiences discovering and getting involved in the rock world in China made me realize that I had sort of not taken rock as anything more than a type of music you can listen to. And while I cranked my Guns N' Roses albums when I was 13 years old, thought I was being a badass, I had no real sense of what rock could do. And saying this, I know, probably sends sort of tingles, not tingles, cheese, whatever happens when you hear a lot of cheese. Cheese, yeah. Something where if I were to say rock and roll is going to change the world, I know what the reaction is here. And I was talking to somebody who said, you can't start a band without irony these days. And I think that in China, one of the problems with China is that there's not a lot of irony. And there's going to be irony. I swear there will be. And it's going to be great. But on the other hand, it's a great thing because what they've taken up that sort of 60s mantle. They certainly did in the earliest days, because the 80s to Chinese folk living in this world where they just discovered Western pop music looked a lot to them like the 60s in the United States, when people really meant it, that rock could change the world. And so Chinese guys, through Yaogun, have discovered that it can change the world. And so I'd like to bring that back to rock. So I think rock and roll could learn something from Yaogun as well.
Very good, full circle stuff.
Yeah.
Sui Gen.
Yeah.
he's regarded as Yalguna number one. Can you tell us a bit about his upbringing and sort of bring everyone into the story of Sui Jian?
Sure. Sui Jian, who maybe it's easier to call him CJ, because even though I, don't like not saying his full name. But anyway, he was born in the early 60s. He started out as a classical trumpet player, and he was playing in what became the Beijing Symphony Orchestra eventually, and that was his life. When you have a job in the 80s in China, when he joined the symphony, you have a life. You have an apartment. You have everything covered that you could ever need. Your salary is kind of minimal because there's nothing to spend your money on because everything's taken care of by your work unit. So this is his life, and he's raised by his parents are also his father is a musician and his mother is a dancer, a traditional dancer. So he hears Western pop music, and his mind is blown by people like Lionel Richie, Karen Carpenter, and other notorious rock and rollers of that school, but also guys like Public Enemy. He's one of the first people to hear Public Enemy, The Police, and everything else from there, from Bob Dylan to onward. He hears this music and he starts to, like a lot of people his age, really get into it and try and learn how they do what they do. And I've heard him sing Hello by Lionel Richie in English, and it's not really that pretty. But at the same time, there's this idea, because what he says is, it's not that he's ashamed, it's just, it was music and he was doing it, and he was so happy to be involved in doing music, and this was new. And it was brand new. So he started to go the pop route, and he's actually one of the countries by the mid 80s. He's relatively well known as a pop singer, not writing his own material, not performing his own material. He's writing his own material in his own way, but not for an audience just yet. And so he comes out of this pop world and then invents basically, or kicks off Yaoguan by performing a song that he gets to play on national television. And then from there, he's huge. He's the first rock star. He's the only rock star for a little while. He gets on the bad side of authorities, as rock stars are wont to do. He does perform in Tiananmen Square, which a few other people did in 1989, in the weeks leading up to June 4th, when the tanks rolled in. But then again, the government sends him in 1990 on a tour of the country to help raise money for the Asian Games that are happening in Beijing in 1992. So, this sort of love-hate relationship, that tour goes sour as well, because people are so into Sui Jian, and they're really not behaving like the authorities want stadium audiences to do. So then he gets back on the bad side, and he's in and out of favor in the 90s and even into the 2000s. And he's still, he just released a 3D concert film, which is the first of its kind in China. It just came out in the past 6 months, I want to say. And he's still sort of the biggest name that there is in terms of Yaoguan. And he's one of the only guys that has become famous, but also maintains this credibility as a rock and roller, as opposed to other people who are seen as having sold out.
Actually, that's a good point. There's a quote in your book sort of regarding that. Today, the idea is if you have money, you're amazing. The way we treat the wealthy today is how people in the cultural realm were treated then. The first big rock names went looking simply at becoming pop stars and getting famous and rich. They saw their work as cultural, so when rock started, it was already placed on a pedestal. It's from critic Hao Fang. Yaoguan number two, and someone who massively helped the career of Sui Jian, was Zhang Yodai, the DJ.
Zhang Yodai, yeah, that's right.
This shirt, I can say anything, it's fine. He was sort of like the Molly Meldrum in a lot of ways, John Peel in the UK, and he was the only person allowed to play Sui Jian's music. Why is that?
Yeah, it's a tough question. Why he was allowed to play Sui Jian's music is actually quite difficult to answer. It's kind of anybody's guess, because even today, I talked to a DJ not so long ago who said that she could only sneak Sui Jian on the radio, and it doesn't make sense to sneak something on the radio, but what she said is we play the song and then we don't tell people who it was. It's just sort of in there. But Zhang Yodai is interesting. His name in Chinese means has tapes. Yodai, that's what everybody calls him. And he was a guy that literally brought tapes everywhere he went. He would play them in the taxis that he took across town. He would show up to parties then. It wasn't so much concerts or gigs. And invariably, the guys with the sound gear would have like a Richard Clayderman tape. Does that even resonate with people, Richard Clayderman? Okay. Good that it's unfortunate too. But yeah, sorry, Yodai would have his tapes with him, and he would be the guy that got known as the guy that had a lot of music on him. He eventually gets on the radio doing a Western pop show, which is broadcast on Sunday mornings at like 8 in the morning, something ridiculous. But it was one of the only Western pop shows on air. Before he gets on, or as he's on air, his overlords at the radio station, and you have to understand that in the cultural and broadcasting realm, I mean, you're working for the government in China. So his the managers at one point say to him that his hair is too long for the radio. That's one thing that happens. And another thing that happens is they're really curious about Western pop music and about rock and roll as well, because from the Chinese perspective in the early 90s, rock and roll is a dangerous thing, right? This is the backdrop of communism fearing what the West is bringing, and whether the rock and roll was this sort of secret weapon sent to,
There was one official that said they've opened the gates to hell.
Right.
When rock and roll.
When rock and roll came in. So basically, one of his managers says to Yodai, look, can you tell us about this rock thing? And he says, okay, well, there's a guy named Elvis, and then after, and this sort of thing. And the guy says, hang on a second. What we meant was, how is it that rock and roll brought down the Berlin Wall? Or the ceiling of the... because in their mind, communism, the Soviet Union, was undone by a series of rock and roll related events, which is pretty cool. But at the same time, this is what we're dealing with. And so Yodai does this very cool dance where he says that, it's an expression of young people's enthusiasms and their hopes and dreams and whatnot. And so he's sort of been able, he's the guy that's not the sort of bad seed trying to poke people. He's sort of trying to make it work in the context that he's living in. And he's really one of the first guys that gets on the radio to do this. Very quickly in the sort of early mid-90s, there's other people around the country, which is really cool to see. But so many people credit Yodai with introducing them to music of both Chinese rock music, but also Western pop and rock music, which he's still doing to this day.
And you had a lot of this, or when I say you, I sort of see you as playing part of Yaogun. Through China in the 80s, instead of sort of having traditional rock and roll acts, people like Chieftains, Jean-Michel Jarre, Wham, who inadvertently rock-blocked Men at Work, because George Michael and Andrew Ridgeley had overstimulated the youth.
Right.
So Men at Work couldn't tour because Wham had made such a big,
That's right.
big impression.
And before that even, there's a book that was put out by Wham's manager at the time that said they basically sabotaged Queen's attempt at coming into China by painting Queen as crazy homosexuals that will ruin your nation, not realizing what they were.
Yes.
Anyway.
Yes. Even Harry Connick Jr.
That's right.
He was a bit of a badass as well.
Well, it wasn't his fault, to be honest.
Hey,
it was more Bjork's fault than Harry Connick Jr.'s fault.
Yes. Yep.
Right. What happened is Bjork actually in 2008, right before the Olympics, and maybe a lot of people have heard about this. I'm not sure, but certainly in China it was news, particularly if you're trying to do shows. She screams at the end of a song called Declare Independence. Wherever she is, I know she screamed Aboriginal peoples of Australia.
She had a big day out here as well.
Right, Greenland when she was in Denmark, and all kinds of things. So she screams Tibet at the very end. And I think without the internet, it would have sort of faded away into nobody realizing what it was she was saying. But suddenly, everybody was on guard. In China, for as long as there have been concerts, you've had to submit lyrics. And technically, this law applies to everything from basement bars all the way up to huge stadiums and festivals. Obviously, Tibet wasn't on the lyric sheet, although the fact that they would look at a song called Declare Your Independence and say, yeah, you can play that, that's okay, is kind of mind-boggling. But yeah, so what happens is Harry Connick Jr., who comes to tour right after Bjork, they've now gone after his set list, and his set list is submitted. For some reason, the wrong set list is submitted. He's brought a big band to China, and the set list that they've submitted is not for big band, and they don't have any of the charts for the submitted set list. So they sit out most of the concerts in China because he's literally threatened with with the wrath of the man should he stray from the list. I mean, I did jazz shows for a long time, and I had guys that were solo piano players who didn't say a word, and they had to submit their set list, including the stuff they were going to improvise. I mean,
really?
I'm not sure how you come up with the name. I mean, the name was the date that the concert was going to be on, and whoever was sitting there with the marking off the song names was sort of going, oh yeah, that's probably this one, and so yeah, it's the idea of the law was always there. But the thing that you notice in many realms of the country, particularly in the last 10 years, at least in my experience, is there's a lot of gray, which is great until something like Bjork happens.
Yeah, comes along.
Yeah.
Hence the historical lag between Chuck Berry making and his sort of his ilk making rock and roll big in the 50s, and then having to wait 30 years before China kind of does it.
Exactly.
When you were there, my friend, and sort of to bring you into talking about your experience there, because obviously you've sort of been on the front line, and you can tell in this book how much you loved it. There's a word, and guanxi. Now this is all about, to know. Logistically, John's explaining how, I guess, difficult it is to put on a rock and roll show in China. And in the book you say guanxi encompasses a combination of skills from flattery to flat-out bribery, proximity to power, and general character by which it becomes possible to gather juice and get things done. Tell us about your experiences getting past the logistical challenges.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing about putting on shows in China, which is something I did for most of my time there, is just that it's hard to predict what you need to get done in order to get the shows done. And so, for me, I put on a lot of concerts in, bars and clubs actually are quite easy because the backline is there. It's a different situation. Actually, it's an easier situation for bands to tour because all the clubs in China that rock music is played at have their own equipment. For better or for worse, obviously some of it is not great, but it's all there. So you don't actually have to worry about that kind of thing unless, it all breaks, and then you have to worry about it. But also and I've taken a lot of bands to various universities across the country. And it's not so much about guanxi in that case. It's more about coming into a situation where you have no clue, where the people hosting the venue have no clue what live music requires. So because we're coming from a culture that when Cui Jian starts, there's only a singer. There's music behind the singer, but it's it's in the dark. It's a guy with a microphone singing along to a backing track, usually singing along to a backing track, if not moving their mouth along to the backing track. So you have theaters with these great stages and great setups, but they don't really understand what you might need on a technical side. So that's difficult. And the other thing that happened, and I should add that I try to keep myself out of the book because that's for next time, let's say. But this is really about telling the story of how we got from there to here. But my own experiences in putting on shows, like I did a jazz series in a 2,000 seat theater in Beijing for 5-6 years. But in order to get the theater to agree, we had to convince them, because they said, jazz, that's the one they have drums in jazz, right? And I sort of said, yeah, they have drums. And they're like, oh, we can't have that here. Because drums, people get excited. As a drummer, it's nice to hear. But at the same time, and then my partner, who's a lot smarter than me, he said, you ever heard of Bill Clinton? And they went, yeah. And he went, Bill Clinton plays jazz. And lots of diplomats who have come through Beijing play jazz. And so the association first with drums mean, social chaos is sort of off to the side. But then also there's two things that happen when you say jazz. And one is, oh, that's really fancy people music. But the other thing is, oh, that's really dirty underground club smoky music. And so our venue is beyond that. It's really funny that these things are sort of so it's still a learning process. Obviously we've strayed from rock and roll, but just the fact that everything is new in this country, I mean, it seems like it's old because in 2012 you go to a place like Beijing, which is where I lived, and it looks familiar. You go to a rock show, you go to the theater, all this stuff, it's there. But really, I mean, in terms of the average person having access to something like live music, we're talking about not 30 years yet. And so you don't have the infrastructure to support it.
So still kind of fledgling, I guess, in a way. To turn the clock back to the mid-'80s, and we've spoken about Sui Jian, should we show the people this amazing performance?
Oh, sure.
Yeah, it was like China saw people having the We Are the World concert, and they wanted to do something very similar called Let the World Be Full of Love, which had 100 stars.
The first thing to note is that they noticed that in Western countries, you had something like 30 pop stars at most. And so they said, we're going to do it bigger. And they called it the 100 stars, but it was actually 107 people. So this is May 9th, 1986. So we're going sort of back in time again. But it's so this is the reason that Sui Jian got on television to sing the first Yao Gun song. So the first thing I'd do is play this minute and a half, I promise, and you'll thank me later, clip of this, what is a 15-minute, this just craziness of it's We Are the World times 15 minutes, basically, with 107 people. So this is the first thing that you'll see.
Should we jump out of the way?
There it is. Oh, it's 1986. Everything's blurry in 1986. Sorry.
走来，他走来，我们走到一起来，
在这缤纷的世界里，心潮澎湃。
你走来，他走来，大家走到一起来，
在这缤纷的世界里，有无限的爱。让这世界有真心的爱，让这世界。
在变幻，唯有渴望不曾改。
生命血脉去相连，永远不分开。
如果我失去理解和信赖，
一切都将不存在，将不存在。
I'm going to stop it there. There was a little bit of recognition, I think, in the room because one of the people that we heard singing was, in fact, Sui Jian. And his line, which I love, is, "The world is changing, it only longs to never change." Which is really cool because of, I guess, what we'll see now, which is the same program on national television in 1986, which means when you say there were a lot of people, you say everybody saw American Idol last night, but literally everybody who was watching TV was watching this. Because there were only 3 channels and they only had a few hours programming a day. So next is, after Let the World Be Full of Love, is Sui Jian's song, of Yao Gun's first song, called Nothing to My Name. I got to mute it there because this version has some narration over top. So I guess we'll just sort of do that. No.
I think in the book as well, you described what happens in here, which is Sway bounces doing a pseudo Running Man, alternately machine gunning his saxophonist and grinding his axe with his midsection. Duck walking, and as much as is possible for this rocker, only a few years from first picking up a guitar, waving and flailing his instrument like a man digging for his life. Well played.
Yeah, and that does happen but yeah, believe me.
Kurt Cobain gets spoken about quite a lot in this book. I think Radiating Nirvana is one of the books, sort of the tome mentioned in it. Was Sway Jen a hero or an anti-hero?
I guess that's a good question. I would say hero because there isn't a sense of alternative for quite a while into his career. I mean, Kurt Cobain is dead before much of the country knows his story. So you have a sort of alternative that emerges in the mid-90s. Where the idea of anti-hero is more resonant, rather than with Sway Jen, who is a guy that's really that clip is that song woke up a lot of people not by sort of it's a pretty it's a nice sounding song. He didn't seem angry. I mean, the one adjective that people use is constipated to describe back then in particular. He's definitely, got a moan to him, but it's not, I don't think he's coming from the angry side of rock and roll. I think he's coming from more of the sort of hopeful side. I mean, this is combining the idea of the 60s in the United States with the idea in the socialist scheme of an artist, with a capital A, making art with a capital A, and sort of being a part of the revolution that's never over in the socialist scheme, because we're constantly striving to be better and better and a more perfect society. Is
the Chinese government funding rock and roll? Are they realizing that we're going to be this global superpower, and everyone's saying the sleeping giant has finally awoken? Are they looking at this now and going, hang on, if we put money into this, we're going to be even, in this sort of section of the arts,
sure,
can be big?
I mean, I still think you have a situation currently in the country where you can't call a rock festival a rock festival. You have to call it a music festival. You can't use that word. Yaoguan is still something of a dangerous word. And so, but on the other hand, there's music festivals. There's hundreds of music festivals across the country now. And that's because local governments have gotten into the festival game. It's not so much that they want to invest in rock because they want to grow the industry. It's more that they want to invest in a festival because in their scheme, it attracts tourists to their otherwise sort of unnotable towns. The biggest festival, the most well-known festival in China is called the MIDI Music Festival. And in 2009, for their 10th anniversary, which happened to coincide with the People's Republic of China's 60th birthday, which is a hard thing to compete with because they can say that nothing's allowed to compete with it. So they moved to another city that invited them. The MIDI Festival moved to a city that before they had the festival there was basically known for making vinegar. And it's sort of in this region it's sort of in the Shanghai region, but it's constantly the sort of redheaded stepson of the other sort of more historically interesting cities and towns around it. So they said to MIDI Festival, hey, come on down to our city. We'll help you have a festival. And they paid lots of money for it. And 20,000 people. I mean, it depends who you ask, how many people were there, but literally thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of people went to this town to see the festival. Did it increase their tourism revenue? I would say, based on the audience of the MIDI Festival, no, because these kids aren't going to buy souvenirs and going on the local bus tours. But at the same time, there's an idea that we need attention on our city, and the music festival is one of them. So that's one way that the government is getting involved. But on the other hand, the Ministry of Culture, which is not known for getting behind anything remotely alternative. I mean, I'm guessing, I know that Australia has been visited and been blessed with a guy named Sean Tenzenman who's in Sydney, and I know that he's distributed a lot of music and helped a lot of bands do tours recently. But the Ministry of Culture, when they put on some event in a foreign country, it generally involves acrobats or Shaolin Kung Fu or a combination thereof. Recently, though, they've worked with, in fact, MIDI, the organization behind the festival, to send heavy metal bands to Wacken, which is the biggest heavy metal festival in the world, certainly in Germany, but probably that means the world, because it's metal in Germany. But so they're getting involved in different things. So it's this very strange situation where, on the one hand, does Yaogun want the Ministry of Culture to help them get into the world? And the answer is probably most people would say no. On the other hand, if they call you and say, hey, do you want to go to Wacken? Like, who's going to say no?
Absolutely. Tell us why you think that no great big, like a giant Chinese band has come through and sort of every genre of music, even like look at Tame Impala in Australia at the moment. They're kind of the band that seem to be breaking through a pitchfork and on the Billboard charts and all across Europe. Why hasn't that happened with China, considering the population is
it's a really good question, and I don't know if I have a really good answer. The immediate reaction from people is, well, they sing in Chinese, so that's just going to be weird. But I mean, my thing is always, I sang along with La Bamba, and I didn't care that it was not in English, or maybe didn't realize, I don't know. But I think it's really, first we have to get past this idea of curiosity. And I totally respect and understand why people are curious. I tell people I wrote this book about Chinese rock and roll music, and they look at me like I've switched languages and not, you know what I mean? It doesn't compute. And I get that, because where would you hear about this sort of thing? The idea of China, we're still sort of stuck because of the way it's portrayed, unfortunately. For a lot of people, China is not 2012. So I think once we get past that, because I've seen what happens when Western audiences see Chinese music, and I'm guessing that a few people in this building have been to gigs in this country where Chinese bands have played. And when Hedgehog was here last week, in fact, and they're a great band to watch. I took a band called Subs to Europe a couple times and sent them a couple more. And what was interesting for me to see was that the literal transformation in front of my face of an audience going, oh, isn't that that's not cute. That's a bad way of putting it, but that's so wild. They're from China. Like, I got to check this out. And wow, they're playing rock and roll music, and they're from China. And then sort of throughout the course of Sub's show, which they're a pretty, they're a garage punk act that's there's a lot of screaming, there's a lot of really screamy guitar, and I think it's an amazing live experience. But then and at the time I was long-haired and shaggy and unauthorial, I guess is the best way but flip-flops, and I had no business being in half of the places that we ended up. But I would have these sort of old grizzled punks come up to me and just sort of gush about how Subs is a band that was the reason they got into punk 30 years ago, and they haven't seen anything like it in 20 years. And for me, and this is a band that's not singing in Chinese. They're also not completely singing in English, to be perfectly honest. But it's not because of what they were saying. I think they were communicating a lot. I mean, yes, there's the context of they're from China, and so we automatically think that they're fighting the power and all this stuff. And they are in their way. They're not saying, they're not flipping the bird at the Communist Party of China, because that would be stupid, because they wouldn't be allowed to do it for very long. But they are making a statement. And so for that band in particular, I think, all that has to happen is people have to see it. And you don't have to be a long-time punk to sort of appreciate it, I don't think.
Before we go to questions from the audience, any predictions on who could break through? You pointed out Lonely China Day, and a few interviews I've read, and I listened to them today. Very Sigur Rós, Radiohead, like incredible band. I can see them, headlining a big stage. Anyone that you think in the year's time will be like, John was right?
Yeah, you don't want to make predictions, because chances are, the bands I would love to see break through in a real way. Lonely China Day is definitely one of them. Oh God, I really should have prepared a list and just read off of it. Well, we have a vote for bird striking. There's a band right now who's sitting in Chicago recording with Steve Albini called PK14, and I think they've been here before.
Yeah, they came here with the drones.
Right. So I really like what they're doing. I hope that they break through. Frankly, I hope because, as I mentioned in the book, Cui Jian is about to become eligible for entry in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Mm-hmm. It's based on having 25 years since your first release. I mean, technically, his first release with the sort of Lionel Richie-esque stuff was earlier than 1989. But he's about to, I guess, so 25 years is 2014. So I would like to see him, because it has to start with him. Of course, having said that, he said when they played in Central Park in New York City, there were more, the amount of, I'll just say white people, non-Chinese, they call them foreigners, even when they're in America, and it doesn't matter. There are more white people watching Cui Jian's concerts in China than there were in Central Park, like on a per capita basis, right? Mm-hmm. Because he still hasn't broken out of that Chinese community. I hope that changes, because it needs to start with him. As much as people say he's old news, whatever, he's the guy that started it all, and he's the guy that's been fighting the whole time. And he's really, I think, the one that should sort of kick off a real appreciation.
And he's produced a lot of records as well, I believe. In 97, he did, is it Q Ye's album?
He did.
Which pretty much...
yeah, he did. It's a band, Choya, it's called, they're from Tianjin, and they are called... Oh my goodness.
It doesn't matter.
No, it totally does. Because they're an interesting mix of traditional Chinese plus contemporary, well, not contemporary, yes, contemporary, prog rock. Zuyue, thank you, Jez. Thank you. Yeah, Zuyue.
Very, very good. We should cut to some questions if you guys... Julian, anybody? Anything at all?
Really?
I think that it's interesting that really I think there is... The problem of government interference is still a really big thing in China, because like the bird striking album, I think the Ministry of Culture didn't approve the release of that. So to get that record out, I know the band are now looking at Tenzin Men in Australia putting out the record, and there's a possibility of it getting licensed by an American label. So they're actually having to look outside of China to get their music out there. But also an interesting thing, a lot of people might not realise, but when the Dirty Three they were touring China, apparently the Ministry of Culture tried to shut down their show for objectionable lyrical content, which, as everyone knows, is a bit ludicrous.
Yeah, I mean, it's not with subtlety that the Ministry of Culture operates, and whatever the band is, if they're releasing a record and they want a barcode, they got to submit the lyrics, and if they get the grumpy old man, then they probably get it cut. And if they have written out all the lyrics that they've spoken on the album, which is not what people do all the time. I mean, there's ways of making the F word not sound like it's the F word on paper and in voice. So I mean, it's a you just got to know how to play the game. I mean, we're still the fact is, whether it's Bjork or whether it's bird striking like you're mentioning. We all know the rules. I mean, maybe Bjork didn't, but her presenters sure did, under which things operate. And if you can't do it above board. If you want to do it above board, you just gotta play the game.
The live music scene here in Melbourne had massive problems a few years ago when we had this weird 2 a.m. lockout with this Premier Brumby, who's no longer in power. We had a 20,000 strong protest through the streets of Melbourne, Slam, Save Live Australian Music, which really worked incredibly well, and certainly something a lot of people in this room attended. Would that work in China, or with Tiananmen, thinking about what happened in Tiananmen Square, among other things, it's just not, when you say play the game, that's not how to play the game?
Yeah, I mean, it's there are people like Cui Jian. I mean, his lyrics are... people talk about how amazing his lyrics are, and they're amazing because that song, Nothing to My Name, he can say it's a love song about a guy who wants a girl, but the girl says you have nothing, right? But nobody who's heard that song in the last 30 years thinks it's actually a love song about a guy and a girl. He is very good at playing the game. When he did he's most well known for coming back from the sort of from being out of favor with authorities by doing an anti-lip syncing campaign. And if you think of something rock and roll, or the most un-rock and roll you can think, it's, you know, anti-lip syncing. Like, why would you bother, right? But I think what he was getting at wasn't, you know, we need to stop rockers from lip syncing, because nobody was. It's about, if the singing's fake, then what else is fake? And it's more than just music. And it's this battle between Yaogun and pop culture, pop music, mainstream culture, that I think Yaogun again shows the way. I mean, when you have musicians and not a backing track, you can't have lip syncing.
I guess J-pop and K-pop and you know, a lot of what's the equivalent Chinese pop?
And it's based on the language.
Will they ever coexist happily, Yaogun and Cantopop and Mandopop?
Well, in as much as any sort of pop music and rock music coexist. I mean, you don't see the level of, like, even the sort of, let's say, the Green Day equivalent in China hasn't risen to the level of Green Day. If their music has sort of softened a little, it's still the same message, it's still the same people, it's still the same mission. It's not on stadium stages just yet, but at the same time, so we haven't seen anybody really rise and attempt to remain really Yaogun yet.
There is a slight tall poppy syndrome as well. I notice you touch on it often in your book. Anything that goes overgrown. The all-girl band Cobra, they sort of started getting a lot of attention overseas. There's one other group as well, which I might not be able to find, but they were getting a lot of attention overseas, and all the Yaogunners were like, no, that's no good. You know?
Right. It's tricky. I mean, there's this weird relationship with the outside world where, for a lot of the country and a lot of different parts of society, going away outside of China and making a name and coming back is supposed to be a really great thing. You know, you're a haigui, like a turtle. It's some kind of turtle, golden. Anyway, the point being, it's a lot better than it sounds. The point is, like, you come back with this credibility that you can't get at home. But I think in the Yaogun sphere still, because, you know, the opportunities for overseas have been so slim for real rock and for rock and roll bands, not real rock, just for rock bands in China, because they've got to foot the bill. And there's been recently some deep pockets that have gotten involved. But again, the focus is really on inside the country. It's not yet, you know, on outside the country.
Any questions, folks?
Hi. I was just wondering, how do the bands utilise, like, contemporary media, Twitter, internet, those sort of things?
Yeah, I mean, there's Chinese equivalents for everything. There's a website called Douban, which is basically MySpace, Facebook, the whole thing in one, which I guess is what Facebook has now. But anyway, there is a Chinese version of Twitter called Weibo, which is now, I mean, it's a source for all kinds of people, whether it's kids looking for a gig, whether it's journalists looking for comment on a story. Weibo is where a lot of, just like Twitter in the West. In terms of bands using it, I mean, Douban has really grown as a way for bands to have music online and accessible to stream and to download. Having said all that, you know, the Chinese audience is a lot like audiences everywhere, and there's a lot of opportunities to sort of skirt those sites and get a hold of music through nefarious means, I guess. Which is, you know, but again, the tradition of getting rock and roll in China has been through non-legal means, because there was so little available through above board methods versus the trash that record companies in the West threw to the Chinese dumps that then made its way to that an industry was built around for these little tiny shops that had piles and piles of the most random collections of music that had a cut taken out of it, and so your tape or your CD sometimes didn't play the last track, and your tape sometimes was easier for the remember tapes for it to implode.
And is that where Badai came in?
Badai.
Sorry.
I would say, yeah. I mean, Badai is this process whereby a guy like Cui Jian listened to Lionel Richie over and over and over and over and over again and tried to figure out how he made the sounds that he was making so that he could recreate it. And that the idea is, Badai means scraping the tape. I mean, they were literally taking the music off of that tape. Yeah, I mean that's sort of the roots of like just listening real hard versus the the garbage that came over. The word is dako because it's cut, these cut tapes and CDs that basically without them and without the pirated music that came with the internet that made it easier for pirates to recreate the records that were selling overseas. Without that, there'd really be very little rock and roll, because before that it was, the random Westerner you met with a tape collection, or the guy that went overseas and met some people who were like, oh, you're from China, take this tape back. And you talk about a mixtape culture. I mean, there isn't a bigger one than China, because it's just this random, they would get Grammy compilations, and just sort of eat that up. And all the tapes from students visiting as well.
Metal is still quite, it still sells, You ask anyone in the record industry, people are amazed by just the loyalty with metal bands. Tang Dynasty, Black Panther, people like that. Are there new metal bands that are selling really well? And not just selling, money, but are they touring? Are they
Yeah,
have they got an
the
audience?
metal scene is one of these. You started out, there's a quote from the book that metal was the first mistake of Yaoguan, and that comes from the idea that the first listeners, the first bands that came out were super influenced by heavy metal, because that was the first thing they heard. And if you think about it, it makes perfect sense, because then they went back and listened to the Beatles and they were like, so what, right? So they didn't have that process by which you sort of, like even myself, like I didn't start with the Beatles, but you sort of put it in its place. But it's all around us in a place like Australia or Canada, whereas it wasn't there, and so you had metal really and so the first stars. Black Panther. What's interesting about that band is, first of all, it's a much more cuddly band than an image than it sounds. They were a conscious decision to combine Bon Jovi and Wham. Those are literally, they literally said that. So you have their version of metal versus Tang Dynasty, which comes from the perspective of an American Chinese who moved to China in 1988, named Kaiser Kuo, who had a love of prog rock and heavy metal. And so he sort of helped, and he was the first to say that it wasn't just him, but Westerners, early arrivals throughout the years have said, it's because of me that, and not an ego thing, they literally held the key to the future of Yaoguan, because at the time there weren't that many sources for information. So because Tang Dynasty is this metal band, they've become huge very quickly. And by 1992, 93, they're the first wave of signed bands that are selling platinum level records. But they sort of not very quickly, soon thereafter sort of stray from the sort of heavy side of metal and sort of veer into pop territory. And right now, they just because they headline stadiums across the country doesn't mean they're not a Yaoguan band anymore. But if you ask a lot of people, heavy metal is no longer represented by a band like Tang Dynasty. Heavy metal is represented by a band like Suffocated, which is sort of death metal. But having said all that, there are literally, I learned a lot about music living in China, because I didn't know, all the various schools and how very particular each school is about its, definitions of what makes it a particular genre of music. There's so much, and the metal community is so well informed about heavy metal around the world of all kinds. The first, a very important music magazine called Painkiller comes out of some metal fans' love of the music and their interest and their desire to tell the country about it. And they're the most savvy. I find that the metal community speaks the best English as well. And so in terms of being able to communicate to their fellow citizens what's happening outside the country, that's enormous. And it didn't happen like that for all the other kinds of music.
Have you ever played in a metal band yourself?
I wouldn't say that I played in a metal band myself. There's a guy out there who knows that we have some Black Sabbath sort of in us that we've played, but yeah, there you go.
Another question.
See that?
Sorry?
In what cities is the scene strongest, music scene generally?
It depends what you're looking for. If you're looking for post-rock. One of the great cities is Dalian, which is a northeastern city that nobody's ever heard of that probably has 15 million people. There and in a small city out of Anhui came a lot of post-rock. And then in a place like Wuhan, which is it's on the Yangtze River toward the middle of the country, a very strong and early punk scene emerges. Shanghai has a lot of very sort of quirky, there's a lot of pop because Shanghai has money, and there's that, but there is a lot of this sort of experimentally things happening. Beijing.
Like New York, really, I think, in the scheme of things, I think that's sort of quirky, experimental.
Sure.
A little bit like Tokyo as well. It's got that same kind of gloss to it.
Yeah, I mean, so Shanghai, like only recently though, because Shanghai is the city that people go to make their millions. And so for a long time, Beijing was really the only place where you had rock and roll music, and you had a range of it, and you still do. Shanghai for a long time was a jazz town, just as a nature of its own tradition, dating back to when the Europeans were living there in large numbers. In the northeast of the country, in the far northeast of the country, heavy metal, to go back to that, is really big. So there are bands now going on 40-city tours of China. So you do have, and I mean, to use that category of how many cities are over 1 million is sort of useless in China because you're a village until 1 million, right? So, but the fact that there are 40 cities that a band would travel to play gigs says that, I mean, it's literally all over.
Good question. Just a quick before we get to you. No rock in the title of festivals. What about a Yaogun festival? Would they do that?
No.
Same
they
thing.
could probably get away with it in English.
Yep.
They could say the MIDI Rock Festival, but they'd have to call it the MIDI. In Chinese, they'd have to call it, they wouldn't use the word Yaogun. Yeah.
Bugger.
John, I know you've tried to keep yourself and your own story out of this book, but can you just tell us what your most sort of, I don't know, transformational or your best or most exciting experience of you as somebody discovering music or touring bands, or your single most defining Chinese music experience?
Wow. It was starting a band with that guy over there. No, it was one of them. There's too many. There's too many. My earliest one that really, I think, set the tone is fresh off the boat. I arrived in Beijing in 2000. I had just gone to graduate school, and I studied China, and it was so exciting because now I was going to be here, and I was going to see it all in real life. And I went to this club called what was then called the Oak Club, which used to be called the Scream Club, and I didn't know that. But the Scream Club was where the punk scene was based, and it was a very important early rock venue in Beijing. And I saw in this bar a band called Wild Children, which is a folk band they were originally from the northwest of the country. And they're an acoustic band. I mean, they had acoustic guitars and acoustic bass, and I think at that point still an accordion and some congas. And they played this folk music that, I mean, part of it I know looking back was me going, wow, I'm seeing it all really happen, this is so... And the idea that I'm new and I can't believe that there's this thing that's, and there's this music and there's people that go to gigs and, because again, I studied China, but I didn't know a thing about China until I was there. And so for them and their music, I really felt like it affected me really deeply. And after the gig, I bought their tape. It was 2000, they were still selling tapes. And I started talking to them. And what was so nice was that they talked back to me. I actually said that I asked if the two singers were brothers, and I said that partly because they sang so well together, and they just seemed, and they did. I'm sorry, I thought they looked alike. And then he said, "Are you and the Swiss guy next to you, are you two brothers?" And so, but after that sort of uncomfortable situation, they were really cool. I mean, the point is, like, they were really okay to talk, and partly it helped that I was a foreigner, because at that point still it's rare for foreigners to be interested in the scene. not unheard of, but rare. And just through talking to them, I thought, wow, these guys are interesting. And a friend of mine came later in the year, and he saw this band, and he said, it's so great that Beijing has a band like this. And so that, to me, was this little sort of validation of, yeah, maybe it is quite exciting and cool. And I think that really did set the tone. I mean, my sort of naive excitement. I still think, looking back now, hearing back, that they did make great music, and it wasn't just me going, oh, it's so nice and Chinese, you know. So yeah, I guess the Wild Children.
Excellent. Folks, that's all we have time for. We said the word Yalgun 36 times in total. Thanks for being so attentive and great questions. And thank you, John Campbell.
Thanks so much to the Wheeler Center as well. Thank you very much for coming. My book is for sale back there, and I hope also JonathanWCampbell.com is a website that you might want to check out. I don't know.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Mikey.
Thanks, man. It's good.